Yeah, no, I mean, like, just touching on that, because I mean, I want to ask you this from a morally and conscious perspective. I mean, take the political edge off this.
Yeah.
I mean, this general that visited, it was stated that he could have been charged for war crimes and so forth, but instead, what police did, they ignored the warrant and they sought their own legal advice until it was quashed. Now, would the police have followed the same principle if the person in question was a non-Israeli? Now, that's what I want to get to. The fact is, I want you to look at this from a conscious perspective and morally. Take away the political side of it. How would you?
Well, I would expect the police to treat each case on its merits with no bias of ethnicity, whether the person's Israeli or Palestinian or of any other ethnicity or from any other country or culture. I would expect them to treat them equally, and I would hope that they do, and I personally think they do. I mean, I have a lot of confidence in the New Zealand police force. Interestingly enough, if you have a look at this situation, and I understand, from the brief stuff I know that Michael Cullen at least legally acted correctly. Whether it was the right decision is a different issue, but he certainly legally acted correctly as Attorney General. But interesting enough, there have been some arguments from the pro-Palestinian people that he should never have done that. But ironically, it was not that long ago that I thought, and we saw that certainly that the Labour government pushed pretty hard this issue of the Israelis in New Zealand who were involved with the passport fraud. So that brought outcries from the Israeli community. So in a sense, maybe they are treating people equally, but the outcomes are very sensitive on both sides.
Okay. Now, just quickly going back to Don Brash.
Yeah.
Don Brash had spoken about unjust treatment of Ahmed Zawi.
Yeah.
Now, are you going to take up this issue? Now, if you're not, why not?
Well, I'm certainly going to get a briefing from SIS, and I've asked them when I saw them yesterday for a briefing on that.
Okay, that's cool. Now, how real is your commitment to keeping New Zealand nuclear free? Now, not being a deputy sheriff to the USA like John Howard.
Yeah.
John Howard's been,
yeah.
What about John Howard?
Well, look, it's definitely unequivocal. I mean, I made it as probably the third statement and third speech and the third day of being the leader of the party, which is there will be no change to New Zealand's nuclear policy and nuclear-free legislation as long as I'm leader of the party. And the reason for that is pretty simple. In the last election, firstly, we had a tremendously confusing picture on this. We said, well, we weren't intending to change unless there was a referendum, but we weren't intending to have a referendum. That confuses the public. Secondly, it's been in place a long time, that legislation. I don't think it has any impact on our ability to get a free trade arrangement, for instance, with the US. The Americans have for a long time argued, these things have decoupled in terms of foreign policy and trade. And I think also, my view of it is that the nuclear-free legislation is important to New Zealanders because it's part of our national identity. We stood up and believed for something. We stand for that. Most New Zealanders, see that as an important, step for New Zealand. And I personally think that changing that is of no merit and is warranted. So, as far as as long as I'm leader of the political party national, then in my view, the nuclear-free legislation will stay intact.
Okay, excellent. Now, I think most of our viewers and most local people would be interested in knowing your take on this. But do you intend to sell public enterprises like Kiwibank, New Zealand Post, TV New Zealand, Air New Zealand, if National comes into power, or go for the privatisation of them?
Yeah. If you go back and firstly have a look at the history of privatisation in New Zealand, both Labour and National undertook major asset sales, arguably Labour more than us in the late 80s. We certainly undertook a few in the 90s. The reason for that was that New Zealand was very indebted. We were virtually bankrupt as a country. So we sold assets to pay off debt. In fact, repayment of debt or interest on our debt was our largest expense back in those days. That's not the position now. As a country, we're quite wealthy. We have no debt in effect. So what I'd say is there's no reason to sell assets purely to pay off debt. I quite liked the idea of the Crown or the government owning a majority stake and some minority stake being sold, maybe 20% to the public.
Because why I say this is because in the 2005 elections, you guys were at the forefront of trying to sell Kiwibank, but now that your take has shifted on that, does that prove that you were in that wrong line?
Well, what happened in the 2005 election, we were opposed to selling Kiwibank. I actually, as the finance spokesman, said we're not going to sell it, partly because about 300,000 Kiwis had an account there, and we saw no point in disrupting their banking activities because of an ideological view. What is absolutely correct, though, was when Labour set up Kiwibank, we were opposed to that. And we thought that it was a risk We thought it was unnecessary, and we weren't of the view that it was a necessarily great idea. From New Zealand Post's point of view, who own Kiwibank, I can fully understand it. The mail business is being eroded from emails. People don't send as many letters now. So we understand completely from their point of view, but from a government's point of view, the question was, did they need to own a bank? But we've settled that view. We're keeping Kiwibank, and there won't be a change.
Okay. Now, in terms of broadcasting and a public broadcasting scenario, now with the digital channel starting up and broadband opening up, global connectivity and convergence is speeding up. What's National's take on this?
Well, it's hugely important. I mean, I've been making the point that there are 1 billion people now connected by the internet. That's a very powerful consideration for New Zealand. A long time ago, we had what was called the tyranny of distance. We were so far from our markets that you could never sell things. It was hard to get your customer base. Distribution was expensive. If you made a product here in Auckland and you wanted to sell it in Bombay, there was just no chance of that ever happening. Nowadays, through the internet, you have just amazing capacity, and you're seeing it, the same thing in the digital and the broadcasting area. Years ago, everything was made by Television One. That was it. Nothing else. Now we're seeing television stations like yours broadcasting to a wide range of New Zealanders. So we're very supportive of that. In fact, I'm of that generation that absolutely believes that's the future for New Zealand, and we'll be pushing hard for upgrading of broadband and making sure that New Zealand is well connected.
Definitely. Now, it's important that you made the note that it is quite important for New Zealand to interact with the international market. Now, in terms of the international market, media arts comes into the foray. Now, it's interesting to note that National does not have an arts policy per se. What is National's take? I mean, how does it envisage creating intercultural inclusiveness in the arts-based and bicultural principles of the Treaty of Waitangi?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is it's probably a bit harsh to argue we don't have an arts policy. There's quite a strong argument in the party that we were involved in the establishment of more of the arts foundations and different committees than Labour ever have been. In fact, the history is quite strong with National, and even when you look at simple things like, for instance, Lord of the Rings, which was produced by Peter Jackson and Meta Workshops, we put together the deal that made that happen. We changed the tax rules that allowed that to happen. So, in fact, I'd argue with you we've got a pretty good history. There's no question that Labour have increased the funding to the arts in the last 7 years they've been in government, and we made it clear in the last election we intended to maintain that funding. So, I see arts as very important across a wide range of disciplines, whether it's music or film or books or visual arts. There's a big range there, and it's part of who we are.
It's because the party wanted to scrap the charter. Now, don't you think it's very much needed as New Zealand is more diverse in its ethnical look than it was previously?
Yeah, well, absolutely. One of the interesting things with the charter, though, is whether it will always deliver. For instance, in music, there's been a voluntary sort of agreement, so a voluntary charter, if you like, to play more Kiwi music. That's worked really, really well. So what I'd say to you is a prescription to put TV programs on might work. I mean, whether you can make people watch is a different deal. What I would much rather do in a way is ensure that the funding is adequate, that everyone can compete for it, so that New Zealand On Air, your program, for instance, can go to New Zealand On Air and compete for funding and have that. What you've seen with Maori TV is quite interesting. We were sceptical of Maori TV, but I've got to tell you they've done some amazing things. Their coverage has been good. So what I think we shouldn't confuse is a charter that says you must do this between delivering quality. I'm quite confident if we put up enough money that's contestable, that all sorts of entrepreneurial Kiwis across a range of ethnicities and from a range of groups will contest hard for that money, produce good quality products and get them out to their viewers, and that will be to the benefit of both those people who watch those different programs and to our government.
Now, I know that this answer this question probably answers itself by you being in attendance and me interviewing you.
Yep.
How much acknowledgement is there in the national ranks when it comes to New Zealand's diverse ethnic cultures?
Well, there has to be a huge acknowledgement. I mean, as I said to you, New Zealand is based on immigration. We welcome immigration. If I look at I think if you look at the future of New Zealand, my children are 11 and 13, and their range of friends come from the biggest range of different ethnic communities you can name. So and that's the way it should be. They don't look at their kids on whether they're white. They look at their kids on whether they like them or not, and they happen to come from a massive range from Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, you name it. They've got friends of it, and that's modern New Zealand.
It's the growing face of it.
Absolutely. We judge people on the quality of their ability and what they do and say, not where they came from. Or I think the other thing is too, while you'll always get some Kiwis, I mean, there's a degree of racism and pushback to immigration in every country in the world. It's not unique to New Zealand. We're seeing it everywhere. I always think that sometimes too it's an issue of digestion, and the second generation, they're well and truly entrenched in the community. People should give this thing a little time, and it's not something to be fearful of.
Definitely.